recorded. So. Okay. Put on my. Good afternoon, everyone. For the record, my name is Liz Braden, the District 9 City Councillor. I am the chair of the Boston City Council Committee on Strong Women, Families and Communities. I am joined this afternoon by my colleagues, Councillor Lydia Edwards of District 1 and Councillor at Large Michael Flaherty. This public hearing is being recorded and live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-TV. It will be broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and FiOS Channel 964. We will take public testimony at the end of this hearing. If you wish to testify via video conference, please email michelle.a.goldberg@boston.gov to sign up. When you are called, please state your name and affiliation or residence and limit your comments to no more than 2 minutes to ensure that all comments can be heard. You may submit written testimony by emailing ccc.swfc@boston.gov. Today's hearing is on docket number 0933, order for a hearing regarding community healing and trust building after child sexual abuse. The co-sponsors are Councillor Lydia Edwards and Councillor Michael Flaherty. This is a very important hearing on an issue that often gets put aside and is not talked about, specifically the issue of child abuse. It is a painful subject. It is a problem that often goes unreported, and it can be it can have lifelong physical, emotional, and spiritual consequences for victims and their families. I want to thank the sponsors, Councillor Edwards and Flaherty, for calling for this hearing today. I will now hand it over to the lead sponsors for opening remarks. Councillor Edwards.
Very much, Councillor Braden, for your leadership in hosting today's hearing. Just confirming you can hear me.
Yes.
I had some audio issues earlier. I initially called for this after talking with a constituent and friend of mine, specifically about injury that she had felt, and how that when dealing with a controversy or an issue with a person who was, I think, well, a predator in the community. I don't want to tell her story, but I do feel that her story, in terms of specifics, but I do believe the issue of how community comes together or falls apart after a scandal has broken is what prompted this conversation. It prompted it because I believe the city of Boston has set up different ways to respond to a shooting, different ways to respond to a fire. And that's through a holistic coming together of resources that braid in together the many levels of trauma to deal with something. I feel this is the same kind of level of coming together of resources that we need to talk about and ask ourselves as a city, are we doing everything we can to respond when, say, controversy about a priest, a coach, or a community member comes out noting that that person has violated the trust of people in the community? Not just the children, but literally knowing that you live next to somebody who did certain things, knowing that you had your children in or out of their homes. It has reverberating traumatic impacts, and that's what this hearing is about. Not only that, I'm having some folks come in to specifically talk about the current system as it is, how people are labeled as sex offenders, and the impacts, honestly, of when they're decommissioned or downgraded as a sex offender on some parents. This is not trying to say that the system is perfect. If anything, there are some gaps that maybe we could talk about today. But I want to be clear to everybody, as the Boston City Council, those gaps that may come up today cannot be fixed in our body. They would be fixed at the State House. But this is for an informative moment for folks to at least again explain the impact on them. I apologize for speaking so long, Councillor Braden, but I wanted to make sure people understood the confines of this very deep, painful conversation. We will not be hearing about specific incidents of child rape or molestation. We're talking about the impact afterwards. And I wanted to also thank Councillor Flaherty for his leadership and co-sponsorship as well, because he is one of the first people to try and talk about this, to go to the State House from our body years before I was even on there. And I want to thank him for his leadership and the historical knowledge, and also the heart that he brings to this moment. If I may turn it over to Councillor Flaherty, Councillor Braden.
Go ahead, Councillor Flaherty. I would also like to note that Councillor Julia Mejia has joined us.
Thank you, Chairwoman Braden, for hosting the hearing, and also for my colleague and co-sponsor, Councillor Edwards, for her partnership in this issue. As she had mentioned, this body has led on this issue in the past, and more recently, our colleagues, Councillor Flynn and Councillor Campbell, had hosted hearings on domestic violence and sexual assault on behalf of the City Council. So it's not unique space, but this hearing is unique, and it's also extremely difficult for many people to hear or to participate in because of the specific focus on child sexual abuse. These horrific abuses can take place in an instant, over a period of years, and our victims, survivors, and their families and communities carry the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. And this trauma takes shape in a variety of different forms. Chairman Hayden, who's with us, he and I had a front row seat working together as assistant district attorneys for the Suffolk County DA's office, and can speak to some of the horrific cases that we dealt with, and also dealing with the victims and their families and the trauma as we prosecuted those matters. And the focus of this hearing, as mentioned, is to discuss how we as the city can empower our victims and families with the resources and services, and also the appropriate tools to understand how to cope with this trauma so that they can move forward in their healing process and their journey. I cannot stress enough how critical it is for us to identify and provide people with a continuum of services. Providing an adequate continuum of services allows us to meet people where they are at in their healing process. Other aspects of today's discussion will be about explaining how the legal process works, how the process can be re-traumatizing to victims, and ideas about how we can improve those processes, and of course about prevention of child sex abuse first and foremost. So thank you to our panelists for taking the time to be here on a Friday afternoon, and for your work in the space. We've got extremely talented, committed, dedicated list of professionals here, and I know it's not easy work. When I had worked in the district attorney's office, it was child sex abuse cases were among some of the most heinous and horrendous crimes, unthinkable at times. So I know so the work that you're doing and how necessary it is, and particularly for the victim. So speaking on behalf of all of my colleagues in the City Council and the administration, that we're so grateful for all of you being here today. So look forward to hearing the testimony and learning more about the issue and how we can continue to partner together to provide a continuum of services for those that have been victimized and traumatized by sex abuse. Thank you, Madam Chair, and my colleagues.
Thank you, Councillor Flaherty. We've also been joined by Councillor Ed Flynn. Councillor Mejia, would you like to make a brief opening statement?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the sponsors for hosting this, for sponsoring this hearing. This is an incredibly timely hearing, as during the holidays, not just during a pandemic, but many survivors are forced to be near the ones that have abused them. I know that this will be an incredibly emotional conversation, but I hope we leave inspired to create change that will make it easier for people to rebuild and heal. As the chair of civil rights, we talk a lot about trauma and how that can impact our whole village. There isn't one easy answer or remedy to this problem, and it's going to take all of us to figure out how to build trust and to heal And I also just want to uplift the importance around the stigma that exists in when you're talking about sexual abuse, especially in the Latino community. I know that there's a lot of hush hush happening, and in many ways, not even trying to acknowledge that this is happening. And I think that that part of the healing and that part of the denial doesn't help when you're trying to heal. So I think that as we continue to have this conversation, I just want to uplift the stigma that exists, particularly in communities of color, when it comes to this. And I know in the Latino community, this is running rampant. So really happy that the makers have brought this forth and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Councillor Mejia. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Councillor Braden. Thank you, Councillor Edwards and Flaherty for filing the hearing order. Councillor Braden for chairing this important hearing as well. Child sex abuse is extremely traumatic to the victims and their families. And it's, as Councillor Mejia mentioned, it's often not talked about, especially in the immigrant communities. I'm glad that we're having this conversation now about how we can help the victims heal and help the community heal as well. I worked with Councillor Campbell last year on a sexual assault and domestic violence hearing. We held that at Northeastern University with their domestic violence task force at Northeastern University. And it was powerful to hear the panelists' testimony. I know that these types of issues are difficult to talk about and often underreported because of the stigma, as Councillor Mejia just mentioned. I hope that we can come together as a community to provide what is needed for our sexual abuse victims to heal and rebuild their trust. I look forward to listening to the panelists and learning more about how the city can be helpful. Thank you, Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Edwards, would you like to introduce panel number one, or shall I do that? I'm happy to do.
Happy to introduce the panel. So for panelist number one, or for the first panel, we have some civil or city, state, and county agencies or partner agencies who will provide logistical perspective of the existing system that we have in either monitoring, labeling, and also in responding to child sexual abuse. We have Chairman Kevin Hayden from the Sex Offender Registry Board. We have Judy Norton, also from the Sex Offender Registry Board. Susan Goldfarb, Executive Director of the Child's Advocacy Center from Suffolk County. This is the office that our Suffolk District Attorney's Office works with the most. We have Anne Marie Delaney, the Director of Family Justice Center as well. And we did get written testimony from Stephanie McCarthy from the Massachusetts Office of Victims Assistance, though I don't believe she'll be here today. She may be if I didn't see her sign in, I apologize, but we did have that as well. So I wanted to first, again, set the stage for the current system that we have so we can ask questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. Chairman Hayden, would you like to start?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you to all the city councilors and to Councilor Edwards and Flaherty in particular for calling this forum together on this important issue and inviting us. It's good to see some old faces, and glad to be here to give a little insight on the Sex Offender Registry Board and sort of what we do. I'm going to be decidedly brief in my comments because I want to turn the bulk of our time over to Judy Norton, who runs our Victim Services Unit for the Sex Offender Registry Board. Probably her input and her expertise that's going to be of much larger interest to the folks here. But I did want to just give a brief overview of our classification process. That's how these offenders are identified as most people here probably know, but I'll just repeat it. Our primary mission is to educate and inform the public and to promote public safety and prevent further victimization by making sex offender registry information and information with regards to certain sex offenders available to the public. That happens through our registration and classification process that I'm going to just talk about here briefly. So all sex offenders that are required to register within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts go through a classification process whereby they're ultimately determined to be either a level 1, 2, or 3 sex offender. Level 1 sex offenders being of the lowest risk and lowest degree of danger to reoffend. Level 2 offenders being considered to be at a moderate risk of reoffense and degree of danger, and level 3 is determined to be of the highest risk to reoffend and to have the highest degree of danger if they should reoffend. There are several triggering events that can result in that classification process. I'm going to mention them briefly and then talk about the classification process in and of itself, because the reality is that regardless of which category you fall into, the classification process they go into will be pretty similar. So one could be required to initially register and be classified upon the commission of a new sex offense, i.e. a sex offender who we have not seen before. They just got convicted in court. They just received a sentence from the court for a sex offense, that sort of thing. Maybe they got probation, who knows, but they were convicted of a new sex offense. They're now required to register in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, or they were convicted of a sex offense outside the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and they move here. That would be what we generally call an initial classification. Offenders can also be reclassified up at the request of the board if we have information or reason to believe that their risk of reoffense or degree of danger has elevated in some way, and offenders can be potentially be reclassified down upon their petition if they believe they can demonstrate to the board that their risk of reoffense or degree of danger has decreased in any way. All of those different scenarios will essentially go through the same process. First will be either notice to the offender of that classification process, or a notice to us from them if they want to be reclassified, and then an assignment to our classification unit for the workup and investigation of all the information that needs to be gathered in order for our board to conduct the classification process. So we have an entire unit of individuals at the Sex Offender Registry Board whose job it is to compile, gather, investigate, and organize all of the documentary evidence relative to a given offender and relative to the issues at hand with regards to their criminal history, their sex offense, anything that might bear upon the matters at hand that need to be classified for. So that could be, it can be police reports, it can be their court convictions, it can be their board of probation record and their prior criminal history. It can be documentation relative to sex offender treatment that they've received. It can be a whole litany of documentation relative to that offender that we use and look at in order to determine that offender's risk of reoffense and degree of danger. Once that information is compiled, is put together in a file, that file is provided to the board, and the board conducts what we call a preliminary classification of that offender. So we have, by statute and by regulations, we have 38 risk factors that have been designed and used to determine risk of reoffense and degree of danger. And our board members will go through that file, apply those risk factors, and determine what that offender's risk of reoffense or degree of danger would be, either 1, 2, or 3. The entire process is it's a quasi-judicial process. It's a qualitative determination on a case-by-case basis of an offender's risk of reoffense and degree of danger, not a quantitative one. It's not, we're not running information through some sort of actuarial assessment tool in order to make these determinations. So the entire process is quasi-judicial. So once that preliminary determination is made, the people that need to know what that determination is, the offender, the various parties are notified of that level. And at that point, the offender could accept that preliminary classification, or they could ask for a hearing before a member of the board or before a hearing examiner who sits in the same capacity as a board member presiding over an administrative hearing to hear testimony, to look at all the evidence in order to make that determination. Almost all of our offenders will ask for that hearing. I mean, the hearing process is really fundamental to what we do, because I would say 9 times out of 10, maybe more, the offender is going to ask for their hearing. So hearing will be conducted. There are counsel on both sides. There's counsel for the board and counsel for the offender. All of the documentary evidence, as well as any testimonial evidence with regards to the offender and anything that impacts the risk of reoffense or degree of danger, is presented to that board member or hearing examiner, and that board member or hearing examiner, at the conclusion of that evidence, will go back and analyze all that information, look at it. They will look at all the factors. They will write a detailed decision. Those decisions can range from, they can really run the gambit depending on the nature of the offense and the amount of information that's involved, but they'll write a decision that could be anywhere from 15 to 40 pages that reaches that determination as to what the risk of reoffense is. That is
Chairman Hayden, just in the interest of time, can you wrap this up and we'll go to the next Ms. Norton? Thank you.
So that's what I should start to do. So that decision is subject to judicial scrutiny, and that's essentially how our classification decisions are reached.
Very good. Thank you. I'm sure the panel, our attendees may have further questions as we go further into the conversation. We've been joined by Councillor Anissa Savage-George, Councillor at Large. And Councillor Anissa Savage-George, would you like to make a very brief statement just to...
No, I apologize for tuning in late. Carry on. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Norton, would you like to take it away?
Sure, thank you. Just like Kevin, I thank the council for having us and to acknowledge some of my longtime colleagues that will be presenting today too. As Kevin said, we have a victim service unit, and basically how victim survivors and their families enroll with us is upon the conviction of an offender for a registrable sex offense. And while we take victim referrals from all state agencies and our community-based agencies, the predominant amount of referrals that come to us are through the district attorney's office. We've set up a referral process with a registration form, and they complete that form and send it to us when the cases have been resolved in court. And right now we have 11,600 victims and parents and guardians registered with us for notification and support and assistance. Everything that Kevin described in terms of the process, we notify victims and their victim survivors and their families of the process as it goes along. So when someone first is being assigned for that the preliminary classification review, we send that notification and we invite survivors and their family to do a victim impact statement, because under the law, they're allowed to submit a statement to our process. If the offender requests a hearing to challenge the level, they're also notified of that, and it's also a second opportunity for them to submit an impact statement if they hadn't done it at the prelim process. And then whenever the level is finalized and it's published, we notify victims and survivors of what the level is. It's the same thing as if there's court orders that we receive that, you know, if an injunction is filed stopping us, barring us from publicizing that information, we will notify people of that. And if there is a reclassification to increase or the offender requesting to have their level lowered, then we will provide that notification. And then also if the offender is no longer subject to any jurisdiction within Massachusetts, we also notify them of that. But as all of the statements that you all made in the opening, the trauma continues for victims, survivors, and their family, because, you know, folks register for post-conviction notification, which is really important because it'll tell them if the offender's trying to get out on parole, or when they're going to be released into the community, or when we're going to be classifying them. But what that causes people to do is to revisit all of that trauma they experienced when the crimes were being committed against them. And so we try to provide as much support and assistance through our process as we can, and being mindful of the fact that the process itself can cause more trauma to people. And I think survivors understand that, you know, there's laws that govern what we do. What's hard for them is when the laws that get changed, or there's court rulings that impact their ability to access information or get things from the system that they might need. With the development of the impact statement, it's different than what people might typically know about the sentencing impact statement through the trial process, because as part of our process, the impact statement gets marked as an actual piece of evidence. So that's something that we notify victim survivors of. But so much through the process when we're working things, issues will come up, and we do a lot of referrals and connecting victim survivors with community-based agencies. There's oftentimes need for restraining orders and so forth when the offender's getting out of custody, or things might happen like the offender might be using the victim's address for their registration, or there might be contact in violation of restraining orders and so forth. So we're contacting our partners, our law enforcement partners and probation or parole, or the district attorney's office if those situations tend to come up as we're going through the process. And because some offenders have to register for quite a long time, we're dealing with with victim survivors again and again over time, so that support and information that we provide them. I've the longest standing employee at the registry, and some people I've been working with for over 20 years. And so whenever anything is happening like that, we do provide that notification and information. And we encourage people to use the website and go to the local police department for the level 2 and level 3 information, because address registration changes for offenders. They're moving to different places, they're getting different jobs and so forth. And so a lot of victim survivors use that information for their own safety planning. And it can be very important, even just for the general public, to use that information for safety planning. I really admire the courage and the strength that we often see from victim survivors and their family, their willingness to stay involved with the system, despite the challenges that they encounter over time. That's pretty much it in terms of the program that we provide for services.
Thank you, Judy. Let's see, Susan Goldfarb, would you like to share your testimony now?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting the Children's Advocacy Center of Suffolk County to this important hearing. My name is Susan Goldfarb, and I'm the Executive Director of the CAC. So the CAC is a Boston-based program that works in close partnership with the Office of Suffolk County District Attorney Rachel Rollins, the Boston Police Department, the City of Boston, the Department of Children and Families, and many countless community partners. And our mission is to ensure that child victims of abuse and their families have access to immediate expert care and supportive services when there's a concern of abuse. We've been doing this since 1995, and our focus is squarely on taking a complicated, overwhelming system and replacing it with something that's streamlined and really offers access to safety, healing, and justice. Just since the start of this calendar year, over 1,100 youth under the age of 18 have been referred to the CAC. And of those 1,100 referrals, 776 or 70% involved a concern of sexual abuse. And nearly 200 referrals were due to a concern of commercial sexual exploitation or child trafficking, which often is considered a form of sexual assault. And the most vivid way to describe the work that we do at the CAC is to imagine a team that includes all of the agencies who are responsible for protecting and supporting children. And together we call this team an MDT, or a multidisciplinary team. And the reason we do this work that way is because before the CAC, a child who reported abuse or disclosed had to travel from agency to agency, from the police station to the hospital to the district attorney's office to their counselor's office, instead of going to a single place to get help. And a lot of families fell through the cracks. But now a child and their caregiver can walk into one building at the CAC and they can enter a welcoming space where their team is all in one place, ready to listen and support them. Central to this approach that the team has in place is the forensic interview. And I know some of you have visited our center and seen where this happens. A forensic interview is a sensitive and non-leading interview conducted by a specially trained interviewer. And I think an easy way to imagine that is a conversation that a child can have in a safe, comfortable place where they can describe the most personal and painful experience they've had in their own words and at their own pace with one person. Because the rest of the team, rather than speaking with that child individually or repeatedly in succession, observes this one forensic interview and listens through a one-way mirror. The team is vital to supporting children, and this interview is vital because it minimizes the number of times a child is interviewed and limits the number of people who have to speak directly with the child about their victimization. Equally important, while this interview is happening, a clinician from our team is sitting with the child's parent or caregiver and seeing how they're doing, finding out about their concerns, helping them understand what's happening and think about and help them, support them in best supporting their child. That's where the counseling begins. That's where the trauma intervention begins. And it's so important that that happened concurrently with the interview, because one of the things that we really believe wholeheartedly at the CAC is that kids survive abuse, they thrive after abuse when they have a supportive adult in their life. And the adult who's supporting that child needs support equally as much as the child, because without that support, they're not going to be available. So it's really not just about the child or just about their parent. It's really about both and making sure that they're all receiving the support. Following the interview, we have a pediatric sexual assault nurse examiner on site at the CAC who can see the child. For kids under 12, they can conduct forensic evidence collection at our site. For older children or other kids, if it's non-acute, they'll conduct a medical exam. And honestly, most of the time they're helping kids understand that their bodies are okay. And the investigative members of the team focus on safety and accountability of the alleged abuser and whether or not there will be a prosecution. All of these services are offered at no cost, and transportation is provided to ensure that children from every neighborhood in Boston can access the center, regardless of how difficult or challenging it may be to get there. I think it would be impossible to be here today and not mention the impact of COVID-19. For kids and families impacted by violence and abuse, the pandemic has added immeasurable stress to the pre-existing trauma. And we feel that every time we're talking with a family, the conversation is never just about the abuse at this point. It's about everything else. It's about school, it's about food, it's about whether or not they'll be able to stay in their home. It's everything that we've, obviously we're all talking about every day, but when you put that all together, it's a burden that we're feeling and that we're really trying to rise up to meet, because families need the support at this time. I think it's important to mention that our services have been uninterrupted during COVID, that despite being unable to meet families in person, forensic interviews are happening virtually, teams are happening virtually, trauma counseling is happening virtually, training is happening every day virtually. And in instances where children may need extra support, either because it's not safe for them to participate in an interview from their home, or if they're too young, or if they have a disability, we will open the center and they come on site for an interview. Before closing, I do want to just sort of take a moment to thank you for making space to talk about this important issue, because honestly, it doesn't happen very often. That was mentioned at the beginning, but it's so rare to have space and time set aside just to talk about child sexual abuse. It's deeply personal for many, it's uncomfortable for most. But while child sexual abuse is hard to talk about, we know that children are safer when we make it part of the public conversation, and when we're ready to take collective action, both to protect kids, prevent abuse, be responsive when disclosures happen in communities, and help parents, teachers, community members feel ready for that moment when a child comes to them to disclose. Kids don't talk about abuse because they're afraid, they're worried they won't be believed, they're ashamed. There are countless reasons that prevent them from speaking up. When they do speak up, each of us has to be ready to listen, and we have to know what to do. So that's why another very important part of what we do is provide information and training for parents, for community groups, for church groups, for schools, everyone who needs to be ready to respond to a child's disclosure, but also ready to know how to talk to their child, as was raised at the beginning of this hearing, if they learn that someone in their community may have harmed another child. We want parents to feel comfortable having a conversation with their child about whether or not they're okay and if they have any concerns. So we're really grateful that you're putting this focus on this topic. We want to let you know we're here as a resource, both to support kids and families, but also to help with education and connecting the community, and together keep working to keep kids safe. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Susan. The next panel member is Anne-Marie Delaney. Would you like to share your testimony? Is Anne-Marie with? Oh, yes, there you are. I see you. Anne-Marie.
Hello, and thank you. Yes, good afternoon, council members. Thank you for inviting the Boston Public Health Commission to this hearing. I am Anne-Marie Delaney, the director of the Family Justice Center, which is a program of the Division of Violence Prevention at the Public Health Commission. At the commission, we utilize a public health approach to reduce sexual and domestic violence and support survivors by implementing intervention and prevention programming across the life course, applying a holistic view by supporting organizations that interact with survivors to increase their capacity to offer trauma-informed care, and prioritizing a health equity approach that recognizes the impact of multiple forms of violence, including child sexual abuse, structural racism, and other forms of oppression. One way we operationalize our approach is in the cross-agency collaboration at the Family Justice Center, a co-location of 11 partner agencies supporting survivors of sexual and domestic violence and their families that are seeking safety, justice, and healing. Our partner agencies that provide services for children who've experienced sexual violence, as Susan has said, include the Children's Advocacy Center, headquartered at the Family Justice Center, units of operation from the Boston Area Right Crisis Center, and the program My Life, My Choice. Some of the data of those agencies in the last fiscal year, Susan referred to the number served by Children's Advocacy. The BARC staff served 40 youth on site, and My Life, My Choice provided for 108 new clients, in addition to the 143 they already have engaged in services. These are some of the examples of collaborative initiatives. One is led by CAC and recognizing the significant benefits of a multidisciplinary collaboration. The Commission, along with 25 other child serving agencies and programs, have a formal agreement designed to support activities that in matters of child sexual abuse provide effective approaches to investigations, case management, service provision, and prosecutions. The Boston Area Rape Crisis Center's legislative advocacy efforts, which you will hear more about today from a representative of BARC, include organizing, and in this case, in support, this example in support of the Healthy Youth Act, which would require school districts in Massachusetts that teach sex ed to do so in a comprehensive way, with medical accuracy and a focus on consent and healthy relationships. Also, My Life, My Choice provides a leading comprehensive approach to end sexual exploitation of girls, and along with the Health Commission works in partnership with 35 member organizations on the Support to End Exploitation Now coalition that was created by the Children's Advocacy Center in 2006. FJC partners also collaborate on public awareness and training initiatives, including our own training institute entitled Addressing Safety and Healing Through Cultural Awareness, which acknowledges the impact of structural racism and other forms of oppression on survivors and communities through a trauma-informed lens. Other programs within the Division of Violence Prevention include the Capacity Building and Training Initiative. CBTI has delivered trauma training to over 6,000 providers since 2013, including youth workers, those serving immigrant and refugee communities, homeless service providers, and to those in pediatric settings and the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Advancement. Yet another program is Start Strong, is a teen dating violence prevention program with youth-led workshops that promote healthy relationships. They've trained over 20,000 youth and 7,000 adults in the past decade. They've also developed a web series that uses storytelling to help youth understand consent, gender, sexuality, and trauma, and that is thehallsboston.com. Together, we believe effective prevention requires an understanding of the interconnectedness of individuals, their relationships, the organizations they interact with, and their various communities, and the policies that impact their lived experiences. And we're very grateful to this committee for prioritizing trust building in communities as we do this work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. That concludes all our testimony from our panel. I'd like to pass it back to the lead sponsors if they have questions, or first of all. Councillor Edwards.
Thank you, Councillor Braden, and thank you to all the panelists who spoke today. A lot of what I heard today is an amazing set of resources and the analysis that goes into how we handle specifically the perpetrators, and I'm going to intentionally use the word survivors of child sexual abuse. And so thank you for that orientation. I think part of this conversation is about how we, one, end that stigma. And I think Susan said it wonderfully. It's about not just putting on the shoulders of the specific survivor and making it so that it's just about them and that moment and what happened to them. I think it is important that we provide resources to hone in on that person. But part of this conversation, the reason why it's bigger, is because the injury is reverberating as far as I have seen. As an elected official, I've had people come on both sides of a controversy, of an abuse scandal. I've had neighbors who have to live next to each other, right? You go back to the church at some point. You go back to school at some point. And the injury isn't just re-triggering for the survivor. It is, everyone has a dark cloud around them because they know what happened and they know who they trusted, and they all were violated in some way, shape, or form. So part of this conversation is, what do your organizations do for that? Are there group healings? Are there community resources? I'll give you an example. When there's a shooting, there's resources from the police, social workers, street workers, people who go out to find the potential perpetrator, or not the perpetrators, but prevent the retaliation from those who are angry about what happened. And they stick around to try and help heal that hot-headed moment and to deal with the trauma subsequently. So here comes the scandal. It hits. It's a coach. We have outline resources for that particular child's maybe immediate family. And we have resources for dealing with the perpetrator, whether it's the criminal prosecution and subsequent SORB classification, right? I'm asking you what goes beyond that, though, because as elected officials, Liz, myself, Ed, Mike, we hear beyond that. And that is, I feel that is, and I could be wrong. I don't want to use the word missing if it's really here and I'm just not hearing it. But when a scandal broke in one of the communities, you know, the mayor had to come out and address it. Neighbors had to deal with it, and people carry this with them. I believe in generational trauma. I believe that it can be carried by a community. So talk to me about that. Those resources for community harm.
Anyone like to take that? A comment? Or share your perspective on it, please. Susan?
You're muted. I'm sorry.
Unmute. Susan, we can't hear you. That's good.
Sorry,
Thank you.
I thought I had unmuted. I think I can respond a little bit. I don't think I can. My feeling about responding to your question sort of mirrors my feeling when a community is feeling what you're describing, because the experience is this big and our ability to be responsive is not that great, is not as big. But I think what I would say is that what we've experienced often are feelings and concerns that sort of go in two very important directions. One, frequently when there's someone in a position of trust who hurts children and has had access to a lot of children, parents naturally and understandably worry about their own kids.
Yeah.
And in those circumstances, there's almost nothing we can offer that will take the worry away completely, right? But we have had sometimes the opportunity to have a community forum or to convene parents to hear about their most pressing questions and provide them some really kind of grounded and intuitive, I wouldn't say advice, because these are things they already know, but remind them of the ways in which that they can support their children and talk with their children, to check in with them about their safety without bearing down on their children to ask them leading questions or impose a worry on them that the child may not have. So we do have, I feel like we are very comfortable talking with parents and communities about how to support their kids in the face of that kind of crisis. The other piece of it, the question of safety when there's someone in the community who may feel like they present a risk or everyone's trust has been betrayed, that is a different process of healing. And I think it takes partnership almost in responding to that, because we, for example, can come in as professionals and offer guidance from our professional standpoint. But sometimes I also think you need relationship, like people in community who have relationships with those who have been hurt, to partner with us to strategize about the best ways to really give voice to that hurt and talk about how to heal it. Nothing, like I said when I started responding, nothing as that feels ideal or perfect. But I think by even asking about what can happen, it's a big step, because, or very typically nothing will happen or nothing organized will happen. And instead every agency is left with those feelings alone. And I would welcome hearing from others too.
Thank you, Susan.
If I may, Councillor Braden.
Certainly, go ahead.
Just wanted to note, thank you. I didn't know about the resources you can provide to parents, which I do believe is necessary. I think we also just acknowledge parents or guardians, the PTSD that they go through upon hearing about this, whether their child was physically assaulted or not. PTSD is, you know, it can be brought on from knowing how close your child's physical safety was potentially, you know, threatened by seeing, you know, that a car just missed your child, right? And they didn't hit them in the street, but you saw how close it was to losing your child. PTSD then could result in you not wanting your kid to go outside by yourself, never allowed to cross the street, and so on and so forth. So I just want to acknowledge that and bring that into the room And hopefully by bringing it into the room, we start to think as a collective. And I believe we're all partners in this. I don't believe anyone on here is in opposition. But I'm hoping that we start to talk about the PTSD that happens and what resources we can provide, again, community-wide. I love the thought of one day being able to say, community, this just happened. The forum will be to this day. There will be prolonged mental health services for PTSD, knowing what the signs of PTSD are in the community, and then prolonged conversations on community healing and being able to raise healthy kids. Something like that, like how do we boom, 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 for as long as this community feels this pain. And, you think about that with the church, you think about all those different opportunities for people to change a narrative. And I feel that we lost a lot of that because the PTSD on me as a Catholic, just being in the church and being in the religion and trusting. So there's a lot of things that I'm hoping we can talk about, different additional resources. And what that also means is as officials, as elected officials, what kind of funding we're willing to support as well, right? We can't ask you to do more and then not fund you. So I also think it's worth all of us to consider that as well. Thank you, Councilor Braden. I know it took an election. And thank you all.
Thank you. Councillor Flaherty, did you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, just thank you, Madam Chair. Just three brief questions to the entire panel or one on the panel. Just are there any prominent parts of the process that you believe are particularly outdated or problematic or in need of reform? And if so, how can we work together to bring about that change? That's the first one. Second one is, I guess, have the organizations that are present transitioned their operation to virtual? And how are we working to protect our children when they are now spending more time at home, away from mandated reporters? And additionally, while they're spending more time on the computer and the internet and all the creeps that and predators that are in that space, I guess, how are we training our educators and nonprofits to identify those signs of virtual online abuse? And lastly, for those that are the non-panel, but folks that are listening or tuned in, if they're watching the hearing and if there's a question that they have that hasn't been answered, or if they don't feel comfortable asking the question or they want to remain anonymous, then feel free to sort of private message me on the chat, and I'm happy to ask it towards the end of the hearing. So that's it. Thank you, Madam Chair. If you can, if I can get some answers to those, that'd be great.
Anyone like to offer a comment on that?
I'll jump in real quick, just because I think that for us, sort of what we do in our mission's a little slightly far afield from the question you just asked, Councilor Flaherty, but just so people do know, our entire classification process has gone virtual. So we used to do it by way of in-person hearings, both in the communities and also in the houses of corrections and at the DOC. But as a result of COVID, we've transferred the entire process. It wasn't easy, but we've transferred the entire process to a virtual platform.
Thank you.
And that's the same thing for our contact with victim survivors and their families.
It's all done virtually at this point in time.
Yeah.
I'm just going to follow up then in terms of a physical exam. This might be back over to Susan. In the time of COVID, like if a young person needs to have a physical exam and a proper forensic process, is that you said that still happens in the midst of COVID?
Yes. So in addition to all of our services becoming virtual, our pediatric sexual assault nurse examiner does come on site in emergencies or acute situations or when it's necessary. And she's got PPE, the full gear. So she is still available, and that is still happening. I will say too that as far as the remote, there's been a lot of concern about kids not having access to trusted adults and not having the ability to let someone know that they're being hurt. And that was an immediate concern at the time that we all started staying home. Very early on, we started developing training. We did a training with the Boston Public Schools in June, before the last school year ended, specifically around strategies for connecting with kids virtually to be able to check in around their safety and make sure that connections that otherwise would have happened in person could attempt to be maintained, virtually to make sure the kids were okay and recognize when they're being hurt. And just the last thing you mentioned, Counselor Flaherty, was about online safety. The reports of kids exchanging indecent images and just online risks have increased exponentially with the incredibly increased amount of time that kids are spending online while we're all at home. And so we work with the district attorney's office to deliver a program called Stop, Block, and Talk, which is an online safety curriculum. It's delivered to parents, it's delivered to professionals, it's delivered directly to kids in schools. And the demand for that and the need for that has blown up in the last several months. And it's being delivered Monday night. It was being delivered yesterday, I think, in a school. It's available. It's now available virtually, and there's a great need for that kind of training. So we do welcome inquiries about that, and are really trying to meet every request that can be right now to deliver that information.
Thank you. I want to go on to my other colleagues. Councillor Mejia, have you any questions for the panel?
I have a few. So I'm just curious about, the studies show that the LGBTQ youth are more likely to experience patterns of abuse, and how are we catering our services specifically to accommodate LGBTQ and gender nonconforming adolescents? I'm also curious about how are we preparing and training families for survivors to understand how to accommodate someone's emotional needs? I'm curious to know how we're working with communities and families to help them address the stigma. That's not something that we see. And I'm thinking particularly in the Latino community, where, like I mentioned earlier, we just often slip it under the rug. And then I'm also curious as to whether or not you're able to do outreach in multiple languages, and what kind of, how that outreach looks like in different languages, and also more culturally responsive to those individual needs. And then lastly, and maybe I don't even know if this fits here, but it's just worth asking, is that in certain communities, people, as young as 13 years old are dating or entering sexual relations with men as old as 20. And while that may not be considered sexual abuse in certain countries, I think it very much is considered sexual abuse in this country. And I'm just curious about how that is handled within your departments, and what that looks like. And if that does not fit within this conversation that we're having, we don't need to answer it, but I'm just curious.
Anyone like to answer, offer comments on the questions?
Did I freeze, or did I
No,
ask
no.
questions not relevant to this
No,
conversation?
I'm trying not to be the one person who's answering every question, so I'm pausing.
Not to worry about it, Susan. Keep going.
So many questions. I'm not sure that I'm actually going to be able to answer them all. I can say for our team, and it's always our preference to interview children in their primary language. And so our forensic interviews are conducted in both English and Spanish. But unfortunately, if a child speaks another language, we do use interpreters. We're not able to interview them in their own language because we don't have trained interviewers in every language. We're a tiny team of 6 clinicians. That includes 6 clinicians, 3 of whom are Spanish and English speaking, and the demand for clinical services in Spanish and for Latinx families has been enormous. And we would love nothing more than to grow our mental health team to be able to offer more diverse staff and more linguistic capacity. We're just stretched to the maximum. And our team, I think, is, if you had asked us this 5 years ago, we had 1 Spanish-speaking clinician, and now with a team that includes more, we are striving to talk with the youth and their families to deeply understand their experience of what's going on, and to meet them where they're coming at this. So with your your example of a 13-year-old and a 20-year-old, we want to respect the family's perspective, but we also bring in our perspective of where that 13-year-old is developmentally and the protection they deserve. So I would say we're, you know, it's a continuous process of becoming better at navigating these differences, but they're vitally important.
Susan, could I ask a follow-up before you answer the rest of the questions in regards to the 13 to 20-year-old scenario?
Yeah.
And I understand in terms of the culture that in certain countries that is more acceptable, but I'm just curious in terms of what your communication is to families who need to recognize that it is not acceptable here in this country, and that there is definitely some consequences for that type of behavior. And I'm just curious as to whether or not there's a push.
I don't know if I would, so I'm not going to use the word push, but I would say there's clarity. I mean, 13 and 20 is a very, 13, there's a lot of clarity about 13 and 20. I think where things get more challenging are 13 and 16 or 13 and 17. And I'll speak for myself as someone in this work. I'm not going to project my own values. The law is clear. The law is clear that that would not be legal. But I think coming, and I'll speak again for the CAC, not speaking for the district attorney's office per se. Of course, we come at this from through a legal lens, but we also have to come at it from a lens which respects the experience of the everyone involved. 13 and 20 though, big difference, not okay. And that will be communicated, you know, with a family in a way that helps them not only understand it, but cope with it and manage it so that it allows them to move on from that.
Thank you. And I move on to our next, Councillor Samby George, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the lead sponsors of this hearing. It's certainly fascinating. As a former classroom teacher, I do worry about, and Councillor Flaherty alluded to it or mentioned it directly, actually. I do worry about when children are home so much and learning remotely and have access to devices, and you know, every young person is looking for a spot to sort of hide in their house so they can participate in remote learning. It has certainly increased the risk and the exposure that our kids are now experiencing. And I think Susan mentioned the Stop Talk, Block Talk effort, both to inform and educate parents and kids and community and educators, all that sort of stuff. Have you seen an increase, anyone, in cases, in the severity of cases around sexual assault? And perhaps too, I would imagine because of isolation and the added risk, especially with technology in particular, access to so much technology, perhaps prolonged trauma and prolonged maybe emotional abuse because of a previous sexual trauma. That's for anybody.
Okay. No.
I can speak again briefly. I really, you know, it's during this time when each of us is experiencing our own stresses, sometimes it's hard to know if what we're experiencing is similar to what we used to or if it's different. But what I'm hearing from our team is that our meetings and visits with families when they come in are they're really intense. I think the impact of isolation, the responding to the abuse, a parent having to rally in the midst of all this to support a child, there is a real intensity that's being experienced. And when you pair that with other needs that families are having related to food and housing insecurity, I mean, it's a lot. And I do think it's reinforcing the need for all of us to need to be able to have services readily available that can support families. Whether or not it's going to require a longer period of being involved with services, it's hard to say, but there is definitely an intensity And I also, I mean, it's almost incredible to me that when it's so hard for a child to come forward in the circumstances, in the isolation that we're now experiencing, that when a young person does find a way to make a report, we are hearing about, serious, sustained, ongoing abuse, and it's troubling.
I would add to that too, that we've also been seeing that degree of intensity, elevating with what's going on with the pandemic. And I think, for sexual assault survivors, that feeling of powerlessness and not having control over so many things in their lives, impact on their jobs, impact on their kids' schooling, that all of that is just exacerbating all of the trauma that they experience. And it's, people are really expressing they're having a hard time gaining mastery over their day-to-day lives with all of these things being prolonged into the future, with no end in sight. There's hope with the vaccine, but people know this is going to continue for a period of time. So, a lot of survivors are expressing just degrees of trauma that they hadn't really felt since like the episodes of when the crimes were happening to them.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question?
Sure.
Sort of the silver lining and the benefit of technology. Are services able to be delivered and support virtually?
It is a real silver lining. In some ways, it's increased access for lots of families, and I think it's something we're going to continue to do, on an ongoing basis. When we're able to see families in person, we're also going to continue to see them virtually. It's been really helpful.
Excellent, great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Flynn, I'm sorry, I seem to have skipped you in the first, just before. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Councillor Braden. Thank you to the panelists. And I failed to mention I had the opportunity to visit the Family Justice Center a while back with Councillor Campbell, and I just wanted to highlight the excellent work the staff does there. So, so I just wanted to mention that. And then the second point was I was a probation officer at Suffolk Superior Court for 10 years prior to being on the council, and I interacted frequently with a lot of convicted sex offenders that I supervised. But I'm wondering, I guess my question is, for young students that have seen sexual assaults or have been a victim of sexual assaults in their home, or have seen one of their parents engage in it, what type of services or education or even philosophy do we have to make sure that we teach, we provide the right services to that family, but also to reach out to young boys too, to educate them on what is healthy and what is appropriate and what's not appropriate, and give them some assistance along the way. I wonder if anyone has any comments or any thoughts about that.
I know I wasn't part of this panel, but can I jump in?
Oh, certainly. And Kathy, it may have worked, but it may have been more useful for me to involve you in this panel as well, to throw you right in there. So please go ahead.
That's okay. So I work at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, so our perspective is a little bit different. We do provide services, but over the last 15 years, we have sort of switched our framework to the prevention work, because we know services are critical, but in order to end sexual violence, we have to prevent it. And how do we prevent it? By doing a lot of things that you were asking. Comprehensive sex ed is the key. There's so much research, pediatrics, OBGYNs, education, anyone that you ask, and they will say comprehensive sex ed, because that will prevent sexual violence in the sense that you're teaching young kids the tools of what a healthy relationship is and what is not, so they will not cross boundaries, you teach others the boundaries, you teach consent. Unfortunately, Massachusetts legislature refuses to address prevention. Prevention is not a topic that we really talk about. There's no comprehensive sex ed in Massachusetts. It has been in the legislature for 11 years, and it has yet gotten a hearing on the House. So it's up to many of us to do the prevention work. It's up to providers to do comprehensive sex ed. But until we have people like you, until we have DESE, until we have the commitment from the state to say we are going to take action to teach boundaries, to teach healthy relations, to say what is okay and what is not, we're not going to get there. So we're with you, or I'm with you, BARC is with you, but we need the support from many other organizations because SORB, CAC, the DA's office, we are at the end of the services. And what we want to do is be like, and what we do, we want to end sexual violence, but we can't until the tools are given for adolescents and the youth.
And I could add two things to that. You know, the way that we look at the information that's available on the registry, that it's prevention. The purpose of that information is to help people be informed of offenders that may harm you or your children, as we know that access provides way for opportunity. And so we encourage people to use that information to be able to protect themselves. The second thing is the Massachusetts Legislative Task Force on Child Sexual Abuse Prevention just launched a website called Safe Kids Thrive that has, it's geared towards for people that work or volunteer or are recipient of services in youth serving organizations. And they help, if you go on that, there's all kinds of toolkits that people can develop for prevention to keep themselves safe.
Thank you. Thank you both. Katia, it seems like a really appropriate time to bring you into the conversation. I should have brought you in, right, because we had two panels and now we've got the makings of one large panel. So please, would you like to make your presentation and then we'll do a second round of questions?
That'll be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much for all the work that you as councils are doing in CAC, the Family Justice Center, SORB. We're all critical to supporting survivors of sexual violence. So I appreciate and all your services. And I hope that you're all taking care of yourself because the pandemic is traumatic to all of us. So I hope that you're all doing something to take care of yourself. So I'm here on behalf of BARC, the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. Our mission is to end sexual violence through healing and social change. Our expertise in sexual violence prevention, response, and education is based on nearly 50 years of work with survivors and their families. We are the only rape crisis center in the greater Boston area, and we supported over 12,000 survivors, loved ones, and community members in the last year. We provide free confidential services to survivors 12 and over, their loved ones and professionals. We work with survivors of all genders from their immediate crisis to years and decades later after the assault occurred. This includes survivors of child abuse who often do not disclose or seek support for many years. Our goal is to empower survivors to heal and seek justice in ways that are meaningful to them. Our direct services for survivors and their loved ones are available in English, Spanish, and other languages as requested, and they include the 24/7 hotline, a web chat, barc.org/chat, 24/7 medical advocacy, which includes support at the hospitals when a survivor is there for a sexual assault exam and evidence collection kit. We are still providing virtual visits and support for SANES during the pandemic. So survivors requiring an evidence collection kit will still have access to a medical advocate. We also provide case management, assistance with housing, healthcare, financial challenges, and more. You can't focus on healing when you're worried about keeping a roof over your head or finding money to buy groceries. This program is even more vital now that we have ever seen. We have seen 81% increase of requests for housing since the pandemic started. And safe and secure housing is prevention of sexual violence. We provide counseling for both survivors and loved ones, including individual, couples, family, and group counseling. We're doing so virtually, and if needed, we'll meet with survivors at the office. But we're continuing to try as much as we can with virtual visits. We also do legal advocacy, through which we help survivors understand their legal rights and options. We assist them as they navigate the civil and criminal legal system, as well as workplace policies and campus processes. We know the criminal legal system is not the answer for everyone, but if they need it, we will support them in that process. We also provide with immigration assistance, so that service we're doing in person because it's a bilingual clinic lawyer, so it's easier to do it in person. We collaborate with agencies, schools, hospitals, and other organizations throughout the city and region to best support survivors and advocate for their needs. In addition to our direct support services, we provide training, education in how to respond to survivors and prevent sexual violence. We also pursue change through the legislative and policy advocacy. And over the last 15 years as a rape crisis center, we have increased and really honed our prevention work because we understand that it's vital for healing communities and truly ending sexual violence. To address sexual violence as a public health crisis. So we want to be immersed in the community, and we do provide community response after incidents occur. Healing and building trust after child sexual abuse requires a holistic approach in the communities that we live and work in. It requires partnerships and collaborations. It requires a response, services, and prevention and education, and dialogue. We need to be talking with families. We need to talk with the community members. Without these, a community will be sending the harmful messages that survivors should stay in silence and feel ashamed of what was done to them. Silence and lack of information is part of what leads to the perpetrators inflicting harm on others. And it's really important to understand that it's not something that victims look for. It's something that is done to them. It's harm that was done from one person to another. Silence and lack of information also leads to survivors feeling shame and embarrassment and choosing not to share what was done to them because they're afraid that they're not going to be believed or supported. The silence of decades is what led to the Me Too movement. What we know, what prevents sexual assault and harassment is conversations about consent, about what healthy relationships should look like, about boundaries. Cultivating open dialogue about sexual health and consent can also increase the likelihood of youth survivors reaching out for support. We know that suicidal and depressive thoughts can significantly increase after a sexual assault. RAIN, a national organization, reported that over approximately 70% of rape or sexual assault victims experience moderate to severe distress, and it's a larger percentage than any other violent crime. We also know that response survivors receive once they speak about the harm that was done to them will have long-lasting consequences. Survivors are looking for validation and accountability. They hope to be believed. And when communities focus on supporting them, creating structures and cultures that support all survivors, which include basic needs such as safe and secure housing, access to equitable healthcare, food, education, that's when we start to prevent the harm that was done to them. And we can truly start building trust in safer communities. Sexual violence is significant and directs impact on the communities we live in and the communities, and it's a community's responsibility to take a step to prevent it. Often communities, providers, and policymakers focus on addressing how to provide services without focusing on preventing the behavior. Services are crucial for survivors. They help survivors and communities to better respond after the harm was done to them. And it is time for holistic support and services to consistently include prevention efforts. One of the prevention efforts that I mentioned was the Healthy Use Act. We need to take action, we need to educate, we need to provide tools, and we need to provide information. And that's when we're going to start taking a significant steps to end sexual violence and support survivors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katia. I understand we have someone waiting to make public testimony. Can we, let's see who it is. Kathy, would someone let Kathy in, please? Kathy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for
Hi,
coming.
Kathy.
Hello, Councilor Flaherty, Councilor Edwards. Thank you so much for getting this on the docket. It's so very important. And unfortunately, I had to be one of those parents that their son was a victim. So about 8 years ago, he was exploited in a sex chat by a neighbor in a longtime community. At the time, we thought upstanding person, dad, husband, etc. And he wasn't. So we went through the whole process of crimes against children, sex offender registry involved, who I tell you, Judy Norton, she's amazing. She helped me deal and heal somewhat through my experience. And the reason why is my perpetrator pled guilty to 4 counts of child pornography and was sentenced to 5 years probation with a GPS, and lived at the bottom of my street for all of that 5 years, where I had to go by the home and, and now he's gone, thankfully, but, and he was a level 2 sex offender, which made me as a mom happy because I knew where he was. And then I get a email or a call, I forget, from Judy Norton saying he appealed to the Supreme Judicial Court for reclassification and won. So the thing for me is, I'm still healing through it. My son's older now, but I worry about all the other children in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so I think it's more conversation on the laws that only can go through the State House in the state of Massachusetts for these sex offenders. So I want to thank everybody for this panel because I think it's so important, especially these days, especially with COVID. So I want to thank you and hope that somehow we can change laws to help the kids of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you,
Thank
Kathy.
you. I had one question. I don't know who's the best. Again, it might be Susan. Someone can answer this. When you have a child who was abused when they were pre-verbal, very often they're not able to articulate what happened to them. But they do know that there's something amiss with themselves, and sometimes they don't realize that, or they know something's wrong, but they can't articulate it. And maybe years later, when they're adults or teenagers or something, that this sort of becomes unmasked and they realize that there's something had happened back then. What's your strategies for working with kids that have been, children who've been abused when they were pre-verbal?
That's very hard. I think if there's a concern that a child who's either pre-verbal or too young to have an interview has been hurt, I think that's when we rely on others, whether it's police detectives or social workers, to be able to establish information so that we know what might have happened to them. I mean, it's always, isn't it always a shame that we have to rely on kids to tell us about their experience, that we have to wait for them to disclose and then give us the details? I wish in a better world, the burden would lie elsewhere. It would either lie on adults finding information and evidence, or just some other way to confirm that a child's been hurt. When kids are pre-verbal, it's really, really hard. And I think it does turn into more of an investigation as far as determining what may have happened. In terms of healing, I would invite others here too to chime in on this. I would imagine that is different for different individuals and could be a lifelong process of understanding one's experience and what the source of it is, and coping with it and coming to terms with it. Very, very difficult.
Thank you. Okay, everyone take a deep breath. This is a difficult subject, a sensitive subject, and thank you all for your work. I think Councillor Mejia indicated that she had some more questions. Has anyone else, if anyone else got a pressing question, I'd like to swing back to Councillor Mejia. Councillor Edwards, you're the lead sponsor, and then we'll go back to Councillor Mejia.
Thank you very much. I wanted to first thank Kathy for her leadership and her, it's hard as a parent to admit that happened. And I think she represents a lot more people in our city and our state than we care to admit. And so Kathy, today you gave a lot of people a voice through your bravery. And through your own reaction to this. And I'm not a parent, but I can imagine those of us who are, how much, especially those who've gone through what you've gone through, how seen they feel right now by the city council, by a lot of these agencies. And also being on the other end of receiving the notice that you will no longer know where the person is who hurt your child or wanted to hurt your child. And so I think it's important that we carry that to the State House to understand the impacts of some of the laws that they're pressing, that Judy and other folks at SORB have to enforce. And I wanted to thank them for that. Thank you so much for that. So to Katya, the question is, so for the other parents like Kathy, for the larger community who are now either in PTSD or dealing with the reverberating effects, who might be living down the street from, what services does BARC provide?
Absolutely. And we do a lot. So in the series, we can do individual counseling. So Kathy will qualify for free confidential services as a parent of a survivor or a parent of a sexual assault survivor. So we will be able to do individual counseling for her son. We could do group counseling for her. We run different groups throughout the year. We could also provide civil advice. I don't know if it was a priest, we will be able to help them navigate with any process if they wanted to do any civil suits to the church, or if it was a coach. So we will be able to provide civil services by attorneys at the office. They will give them more information. We could also, at their request, we could come into the community and have a conversation, and we could try to hold a group in the community, a community response conversation. We do, they could volunteer to become part of our education COPES team. So it will be educating other people and other community members of what sexual violence can do. And not necessarily to her, but at a response of what happened. One of the things that we are really trying to do, especially with the COPES team, is to do a lot of bystander intervention. And bystander intervention doesn't mean that it has to be as a direct result of an incident, but it's the responses that we all have towards someone who's disclosing. A friend of ours who came to us like, oh, I just wanted to talk to you about something that happened to me 20 years ago. That is done, but I just want to disclose. I want to have a conversation. So we're constantly trying to educate people like us, the community, on how to really respond to survivors so they have the best supportive system.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Councillor Mejia.
Yes, thank you. I know I asked a lot of questions and I only got probably like one answer because I went on and on and on. So sorry about that. But I would like to know a few things. One is around the LGBTQ support services, if you could talk briefly to that. And then I'm curious about what kind of training and support you're able to offer educators in the Boston Public Schools, our community health centers. Like, how are we utilizing this as an opportunity to engage all city service agencies in this conversation so that if they come across families, they're able to talk about it in ways that are not so much triggering, but at the very least that they know that this is a space where that they might be able to disclose if they need to. And then the last question is around Councillor Edwards was talking about the passed on trauma that exists. And I'm just curious about oftentimes parents do, those parents who experience their own experience with childhood sexual abuse, then pass it on to their children in terms of by being overly sensitive about certain things. And so what type of counseling and what kind of resources do you offer families so that things that they may be not creating scenarios in their heads about some of the things that if their child is displaying certain things that they don't automatically assume that it's something bad, it just might be just kids acting the way that they do. Like, can you talk a little bit about what type of support services are for families like that? That's a lot.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to sort of hone in one part. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. I came to this country or United States for school and I stay. So working with the Latino community, Spanish is my first language. Working with the Latino community is my thing. Like, this is my passion. And since I started doing a lot of the prevention work and the policy side, that has been something that have been pushing a lot because of the amount of trauma the Latino community experience back in their countries in the process of coming here, the historical trauma. When I think about prevention and when I think about sexual violence, what I know now is not what I knew back in my early years because that's not how it was taught back home. And one of the things that I thought that was so critical is that it wasn't taught because so many people experience sexual violence in Latino communities. The rates of sexual violence in Latino communities is sky high. And they kept it secret and they passed some of the behavior. And for me, it's like, it's not that they don't want to talk about it, it's that they might not know what happened to them. They're coming to terms, they're dealing with the trauma, they're dealing with the PTSD. So addressing it with their children, they might not have the tools. So one of the things that we're trying to do, especially with the Healthy Youth Coalition, is to get into the gateway cities, is to do curriculum for parents of the Latino community. So we can start teaching the Latino community that behavior is not okay. It's not okay back home. It's not okay here. And we're going to give you the tools on how to address it. And that will most likely have to include counseling for the parents because they experience years and years of trauma. So one thing is the education. I'm trying to figure out how to do comprehensive sex ed for some communities that don't want to talk about it for many different reasons. So how do we break in those boundaries? We have Spanish-speaking clinicians, we have bicultural and bilingual clinicians. So it's not just bilingual work, it's bicultural work. It's people that have lived experiences. They grew up outside United States, they grew up in those communities. So we're trying to do that as much as we can. And especially with the LGBTQ community, there have been so many misconceptions, so much misinformation, and so much closure for them to be welcome. So we have been doing a lot of trainings. We do groups. So all of our services are comprehensive and they include the different communities. But the rates of sexual violence, especially in the youth on the LGBTQ community, is significant, and then the Latino communities. So we're two things that we're really trying really hard to address.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answered, but I'm more than happy to chat because we do want to bring the Latino group to Boston.
Yeah, I got your email.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to connecting.
Yes.
Councillor Mejia, did you have any other questions?
No, thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you.
You know, the focus of the conversation was about healing and trust building for child sexual abuse. I just want to round back and think about perhaps, you know, laying down some must-haves in terms of how we get there, and like a roadmap for communities to help that healing process. You know, let's throw it. I think your suggestions about really good sex ed is a really good start. But the other thing about healing the harm after it's happened, like there's a whole intergenerational generational trauma that happens. Like very often parents, grandparents were victims of sexual abuse themselves. So when it comes to their children or grandchildren, the whole thing just kicks off again. And in bygone days, it was like not talked about. So in this time, the way we get to healing is to talk it out, take it out and look at it in daylight and talk about it. But for many cultures and families, that's not the way it was done in the past. So I'd just like to give it back to Councillor Edwards, perhaps to, we have about 20 minutes left. We can talk for as long as we want, but we have a sort of 4 o'clock target, and I just want to wrap up the conversation and make sure that the lead sponsors are satisfied that we have addressed all the issues that we wanted to talk about this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Councillor Braden. We certainly have addressed that and then some. I am very, very, very encouraged by the people who came and testified today and the services that are happening. But most importantly, I'm encouraged by their own words about how this was a long overdue conversation. It needs to happen again. So the first thing I would like is for the chair to consider keeping this in committee so that we can have this either on a quarterly basis or at least once a year conversation as we talk about our budget, as we talk about everything else on a regular basis that is in our forefront in mind. This should be there too. So I'd like to ask for that commitment. And then I hope that in terms of your timeline and building blocks, there's different ways to go here. One was the legislative process and the ideas around what we can support at the State House. And Kathy will certainly be part of helping to lead that way there too. And then there's also informing communities about resources we have, and then learning from BARC and other community-based resources, what money you need to expand the resources that you have. Because hearing that we need to even get more resources for the Latino community, I can imagine it's the same for the Haitian community or for the Vietnamese community or for, you know, new immigrants from wherever they are in other countries. I mean, there's levels, right? And so how do we expand those things as well? I think the same trauma, the same understanding of how to work with police, these are all barriers that we face when we come to a new community or country even. So thank you all so much. I look forward to continuing this conversation and building on the resources that we have.
I just wanted to add one thing. I was remiss in not mentioning. We have a wonderful partnership with the Boston Police Department's sex offender registry unit, and they've been a great resource for victim survivors and families whenever there's been an issue of concern, you know, a safety issue or something happening. Anytime we've ever contacted them to address that, they're very responsive and take action very quickly and are very good on the communication. And we really, really appreciate and value that partnership with them.
And if I might also add, the Family Justice Center, for those who aren't familiar with that framework, the Boston Police Family Justice Group, so the 4 units of detectives, crimes against children, domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, are all headquartered at the FJC and have opportunities back and forth with other community partners that we didn't mention today, but the Massachusetts Alliance of Portuguese Speakers, the Asian Task Force, and the Association of Haitian Women, and the collaborations that have gone on. As one example, I'm thinking one that the Alliance of Portuguese Speakers, along with Children's Advocacy some time ago, put together in targeting communities where, whether it's underreporting or specific communities, parents, clergy, or otherwise, who are looking for understanding the signs, response, long-term, sort of immediate, short-term, and long-term. So there is a lot to say and a lot to do, and we're very grateful for this opportunity. And for those who have been to the Family Justice Center, Councillor Flynn and Andrea Campbell most recently with me, I know many others have been there, and we look forward to 2 more. Thank you.
If I may say something, just quickly, the Boston Police Department, it took me probably 5 times to get all level 2 sex offenders in my community way back when. It wasn't easy for me. If they don't have it in my community, and I haven't been back since. I still don't know. And that's one of the things that I don't know how we can make better, but it was every Friday I went and I was sent to, and they told me, no, you can't have it, until finally they gave it to me. But I had to sit there and look in a book while sex offenders were coming in to register. And I was just, that's something that I would hope we could, maybe there could be a better process for. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
We provide monthly training to all the police departments, including the Boston Police Department, about people's right to access that information. So we have made a lot of improvements along the way in the last few years.
Excellent. Councillor Flaherty, would you like to, have you any further questions, or would you like to make some closing comments?
Your closing comments, Madam Chair. So obviously this was very informative, and it's clear that we need to keep pressure on, particularly as it pertains to victims. It's it's an interesting phenomenon where the perpetrator is arrested, tried, convicted, sentenced, and then I guess through good behavior or not reoffending, gets to sort of move forward and maybe even step down on. Through probation and sort of, I guess, downgrade the level of how he or she is viewed as a sort of as an ex-offender. So, but that doesn't help the victim. It doesn't help the victim's family, who still lives across the street or around the corner or in the same community. And so, just want to make sure that we're doing the best we can to continue to provide resources for victims and their family. And I think this was very helpful in at least giving us the framework of everything that's going on, everything that's available. But clearly we need to continue to work together and do better. So I appreciate the courage of those that willing to come forward and to offer testimony, and we'll continue to stand with them in partnership as a city council to try to make sure that we're doing the best we can for them. And it's really about them. It's, and we're obviously we're in a world of second chances. We're in a world of, recognizing when people have paid their debt to society and trying to find a way to allow them to move on. But this is a particularly difficult situation. In many instances, they're pretty horrendous and heinous criminal acts and sexual abuse in particular that will stay with the victims for the rest of their lives. And it's, how do we carve out and pay particular attention and put a special focus on those victims and making sure that they have the resources and make sure they have continued support and protection from the perpetrators, even though the event happened a while ago and or the person has paid their debt. So that's, for me, it was just about, recognizing that we need to continue to refocus on how we can do better. And I look forward to continue working together. So thank you, Madam Chair, for hosting on a Friday afternoon. And thank you for the panel, all of the time and talent that went into, it goes into all of the work that you guys do, and appreciate that. Family Justice Center obviously has been a great asset for our city. And again, look forward to working with everyone. And thank you to the co-sponsor on this, who's done great work in the space, also as an attorney and someone where we share constituencies, and we want to work together to make sure that we're doing the best we can for folks out there in our neighborhoods.
Thank you, Councillor Flaherty. Councillor Mejia, would you like to make some closing remarks?
Just thank you to the makers. Thank you to you, Chairwoman, for moderating this conversation, and to the panelists, and to Kathy for showing up and speaking your truth and holding us accountable. We definitely have a lot of work to do around sex offenders who oftentimes go unregistered here in the city of Boston, and there's very little way for us to hold them accountable and our family safe. So thank you so much. It was a great conversation.
Thank you, Councillor Mejia. Councillor Flynn, would you like to make some closing remarks?
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Braden. And just wanted to highlight what Anne Marie mentioned and what Councillor Edwards mentioned on language access. But I do a lot of outreach in the Asian community, and went to the Asian Task Force Against Domestic Violence and met with the executive director. And I asked her what her #1 challenge or concern was as an organization. And she said language access, just in the Asian community. I'm probably guessing at the number, but she said there's like 15 or 20 different distinctions of language or dialects. And they just don't have the resources, but language access plays a critical role, as we all know. And the other point I just wanted to highlight is the role of coming from the probation department or in the court system, but the role of the victim witness advocate that is assigned to the district attorney's office also is a great resource, working closely with the victim's family and interacting with sometimes interacting with the probation staff, or interacting with the police, but especially interacting with the family, with the impacted family. So just wanted to highlight that as well. Thank you to the makers. Thank you to the panelists for being here, but more importantly for the incredible work you do on this important subject.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Just to wrap up, I really want to express my gratitude to the lead sponsors, Councillor Edwards and Councillor Flaherty, for bringing forward this really important conversation. I want to thank all my council colleagues, and more especially I want to thank Kathy Doherty and all of you folks who work in the field every day. This is invaluable work. It's really important work. It's often work that goes unnoticed, but I think it's my commitment to keep this in committee and to continue this, to follow Councillor Edwards' suggestion that we will revisit this on a regular basis to make sure that we're moving the ball forward down the field. And I look forward to continuing to collaborate with you all. So thank you very much for the time, taking your time this afternoon to come and talk with us. And with that said, unless there's any other comments, I will move to adjourn this meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. God bless. Let's hope we change the world.
Yes, we will. Yes, we
Thank
will.
you.
Yes, we can.
We already
you.
started. We already started.
Only getting started. Thank you all. Have a
Thank
good
you.
evening.
Thank you.
Bye now. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.